episode of the Doctor's Corner is brought to you by Citywide Community Development Corporation. Citywide CDC is an affordable housing builder in the southern sector of Dallas-Oak Cliff area. Our mission is to revitalize neighborhoods through the development of affordable housing, economic development, employment training, literacy, and social programs that empower individuals and families to improve their quality of life. For more information, visit our website at citywidecdc.org or call 214-371-0888.
Well, hello, and welcome to the Doctor's Corner. I am Dr. K, and I'm so excited about this episode of the Doctor's Corner because I have the distinct pleasure to facilitate a literature review with my chair, Dr. Debbie Nattress. Yeah, those are my cheesy sound effects, but that's neither here nor there. Dr. Nattress holds a PhD in leadership and educational administration and has been an educator for over 25 years. We will conduct a critique of a peer-reviewed article with hopes of helping you determine if it should be your next compelling read. Some of you may wonder, what does peer-reviewed mean? Well, according to the Wiley Online Library, peer-reviewed is a process of filtering literature for quality content and directing high-quality articles to journals to establish journal brands. An article that is peer-reviewed is evaluated for validity and checked for originality prior to publication, because no one, absolutely no one, in the field of academia or anywhere else wants to be accused of plagiarism, right? So, the primary purpose of an article being peer-reviewed is to maintain the integrity of science by filtering out invalid or poor quality articles. So, as you know, on the Doctor's Corner, we provide a comprehensive review, not based on the author, but the writing, the contents, the navigation of the topic, the characters, the storyline, the research, and on the facts. Today, Dr. Nattress and I will offer our subjective evaluation of today's literature and conclude with a rating of either a 5-star compelling read, a 3-star average read, or a 1-star, a less than compelling read. Today's article is a topic that is not often discussed, but physically, mentally, and emotionally impossible to ignore when in the workplace. We will review the research article titled Fight, Flight, or Freeze: Common Responses for the Follower Coping with Toxic Leadership, written by Webster, Brough, and Daly, 2014. This article was published in Stress and Health Journal, Volume 32, Issue 4, pages 346 through 354. Before we begin, Dr. Nattress, will you please explain what a chair is and share a little bit about yourself with the Dr. Corner listeners?
Hello, it's wonderful to be here today. Like Dr. K said, I have a PhD. This is not something I had anticipated doing in my life, but I just kind of fell into it. But I love working for 2 different universities as either the chair, second committee member, or URR. Also serve as a peer reviewer for journal articles, and I speak at different conferences, both in leadership and business, and do some consulting with some colleges and nonprofits. And being a chair is an awesome responsibility and a blessing, and it's even more fun when you have students like Katina. And she was just such a delight to work with. She never took anything personally. It was not a personal attack. I was trying to help her, and she always made me feel like she was so glad to hear from me. Some students are not that way. One of the first assignments in the contemporary issues in business, challenges in business classes, what is your why? And as I thought about that, my why is helping people to achieve their dreams. And I think that's what my role is as the chair, is to, be really picky and have high standards, but to help people to accomplish the dreams that they have. And I was so glad to meet Katina at graduation and just celebrate with her when she graduated with her doctorate.
Aw, thank you so much, Dr. Nattress. That means the world to me. You were the epitome of what I would want to have in my organization as a leader. You were fair, you were honest, you were transparent, you were ethical, you were respectful, and I so appreciate you. And like I said at the outset of this podcast, it's an honor to co-facilitate this literature review with you about exactly the opposite of what you are. So let's go ahead and get started. Our featured article is Fight, Flight, or Freeze: Common Responses for the Follower Coping with Toxic Leadership, authored by Webster, Brough, and Daly, 2014. They describe toxic leadership behaviors as intimidating, bullying, manipulating, micromanaging, arrogance, and engaging in abusive or unethical behaviors. Dr. Nattress, do you think the authors were thorough in their descriptors of toxic leadership behaviors?
I think they were thorough, but there's always other things that you can add to that. I think just not believing in somebody can be a toxic behavior, and constantly putting them down. For example, I had someone who didn't understand why I didn't have a job at that time, and so they asked me to soften myself and not appear as confident or as capable as I was, and maybe I would get a job. And I think that's toxic, because I asked this person, I said, would you say that to a man? And he said, no, I would not.
Wow. Well, I can relate. When I think of toxic leadership, what comes to my mind is a recent conversation between a friend and I. And we were discussing an individual who serves in a leadership capacity at our common workplace. And they mentioned when you have an ineffective leader like this particular individual in top or executive positions, and their behaviors are undeniably toxic, that's when you know somebody gave them a job, like as in charity or donation or some sort of act of quid pro quo. So I think Webster, Brough, and Daly identified some impacts as well of toxic leadership behaviors. And they named 3 categories, which was psychological distress, such as anxiety and depression. They named emotional harm, like emotional exhaustion, fear, and social isolation. And they named physical health problems such as chronic fatigue and insomnia resultant of toxic leadership behaviors. So, Dr. Nattress, how do you think toxic leadership behaviors can affect a person's personal life?
Well, I think, just stress is, extremely hard on your body. I actually had cancer 12 years ago, and I had someone tell me that many of the cancers could be traced back to stress.
Wow.
And how the body reacts to it. And I think also, there's always someone at your work that's always absent, and that can be a reflection of toxic leadership, because they're not going to push themselves to, achieve if they don't feel rested, or they just don't want to come to work that day.
Right.
So they don't feel supported.
Right. I knew you were awesome for a reason. See, you're a survivor. Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. I can recall having a supervisor that stressed me out pretty badly. It seemed like whenever I came into a room, she had like the loose eyeball syndrome. So whenever I would speak, come into a room, ask a question, her eyes would just roll all around in her head. Like,
I never heard that before.
Yeah, I made it up. The loose eyeball syndrome. And I'm sure some listeners out there got a loose eyeball syndrome leader.
It's very descriptive. I can picture it. And, yes, I've seen people like that. But it's very descriptive. I like that. I'll use that too.
And it's frustrating and it's hurtful, because they're in a leadership capacity. It puts you in a position of just feeling powerless. And I would just used to think like, good Lord, why? So I kind of avoided her. I avoided her at all costs.
Which was one of the coping strategies that they mentioned later in the article.
You're right. You're right. Dr. Nattress, before we discuss Webster's, Brough, and Daly's fight, flight, or freeze coping strategies, let's take a brief commercial break and recognize one of our U.S. veterans.
Be intentional, be focused, be motivated. Become these things and more through coaching. Hi, I'm Kimberly with Live Your Calling. I am a life coach and a retired Army veteran. My desire is to work with you on the road to self-discovery towards living what you were called to do. Follow, like, and subscribe on all social media platforms at LYC Purposely On YouTube, hashtag Live Your Calling. Email Kimberly at liveyourcallingnow.com or by phone 214-302-7636.
And welcome back to the Doctor's Corner. Let's quickly recap. We discussed what were some identified toxic behaviors demonstrated by leaders, which included micromanaging, arrogance, manipulating, and bullying, and some others. We also discussed that Webster's, Brough, and Daly's revelation of impact of toxic behaviors on followers included anxiety, depression, emotional exhaustion, social isolation, insomnia, and chronic fatigue. Next, Webster, Brough, and Daly discussed how employees try to cope with toxic leadership. In their article, they identified there's only one coping skill specifically focused on employees coping with toxic leaders, and they referenced Lazarus and Folkman's coping model, which was introduced by Yago, Bazur, and Tamir, which consisted of ingratiation. And Dr. Nattress, explain what ingratiation is to the listeners.
I think the best way to think about it is kissing up. We always have one person in an organization that is always telling the boss how wonderful they are and, what can I do to help you? They're always putting themselves in the position to look good. And I think that's what ingratiating is.
And that would further perpetuate a problem because now you got coworkers looking at this guy like, what is your problem?
Correct.
So it further creates toxicity in the workplace. My goodness. They also highlighted a coping mechanism called direct communication. What's that, Dr. Nattress?
Well, direct communication is actually the probably most productive way of dealing with a problem, which is going directly to that person and saying, there's an issue here. This is what I see the issue is. Maybe this is a way to handle the issue, but it's directly going to that person and being brave enough to discuss the issue. And that's very difficult to do.
It is.
They don't always accept it.
Right. I was trying to imagine myself taking my issue to the loose eyeball syndrome leader, but I don't think I didn't take that approach. I was just trying to imagine it, and I can't seem to get there.
Well, I actually did that to a boss, and he said, you always come up with problems. And I said, yes, I will identify a problem, but I've never come to you with a problem without also coming to you with a possible solution. So I think we all acknowledge that there are problems in a workplace, but, if you're trying to find a solution to the problem, you're being positive about it.
Right. Right. He probably considered you like one of those strong women, right?
Yes, he considered me a threat. He actually told my supervisor that I was a threat to the young males in the company because I was too strong. And I had my PhD and they did not.
Interesting.
I think another thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this article was that sometimes the experience with toxic leadership is cumulative. So you have one leader and then you get another leader that's toxic and the effect just kind of increases because you've got the feelings from the first leader building upon the actions of the second leader.
Interesting. Well, here's our next one, avoidance of contact. And at this particular point, this is probably the route I would take. Dr. Nattress, can you explain what avoidance of contact is?
Yeah, if you go out the door and you see them, you turn around and go the other way, or you go run and hide in the girls' bathroom. Now, the problem is here, we're assuming that the boss is a male. The boss could also be a female, so then you're in trouble.
Right.
Because you don't want to get isolated in the bathroom with a toxic leader who's the same gender as you.
Right. They have support seeking also as a coping mechanism. What's support seeking?
Now, support seeking could be good, positive, or negative. I mean, it could be positive if you're seeking a solution. It could be negative if you're just seeking, someone to tell you that you're right, and feel sorry for you.
Right. And the article shares a little bit more about that, and we'll get into that shortly. And then the last one that they have with the Lazarus and Folkman model is reframing.
Okay, and reframing for me is telling yourself what's true. So restating the story. So and saying this is true, this is not, in a situation where you want to roll your eyes, what's true? What actually happened? How did you react to that? What were the results of that?
So these are the 5 coping mechanisms that Lazarus and Folkman's identified, and Webster, Brough, and Daly referenced Skinner's identified coping strategy, which overall mirrored Yeagel's, but Skinner presented additional coping alternatives, along with poor and inadequate coping options such as feelings of helplessness and isolation. Dr. Nattress, there's a few more that you've mentioned as well, right?
Well, it talks about delegation, submission, opposition. So, just feeling like they can't make a difference. So why should they even try?
Right. And these are methods that employees use dealing with organizations that have toxic leadership. So the author cited Yeagle, Benzur, and Tamir, which is 2011, concluding that employees really don't have viable solutions on how to cope effectively with abusive supervision. Most employees resort to what I did, avoidance. And that
it's effective.
It is effective. It is effective. Not positively, but it is effective. And it hinders individual from utilizing problem-focused coping strategies. So let's move on to methodology. Dr. Nattress, you're the methodology expert here. So do you want to review the Webster, Brough, and Daly, what they use to conduct their study?
Well, you have your doctorate as well, so you've taken the classes. You just jump in as much as you would like.
Okay.
You're fully qualified to discuss the method. I think one of the things that I wanted more from this article, a lot of times, the article is about 8 pages long if you just take the text. And so that's not really a lot of, space for text. I just wanted to hear more about what they did. Supposedly it was a mixed methods study, but they collected the data from 76 people. They were self-selected participants, and they used 6 questions which were not provided. They just had 3 general areas that they talked about questions, and they responded via free text to each question. And then they used 2 reviews of the data, and it seems like it was more of a grounded theory study, not necessarily a qualitative case study or phenomenology or anything like that, because they just collected words. They did not collect any numbers. So they got the data, they analyzed it, they did directed content analysis, and they coded the data, and then they counted, like how many times abusive or emotionally volatile behaviors was mentioned. So it was mentioned 20 people out of the 76 mentioned it, so that was a 26%. For bullying, 49 mentioned it, so that was 64%. But there was no list of toxic behaviors that was given to them. No definition of toxic leadership was given to the participants, which I thought was kind of interesting as well. Okay. They had no formal definition. Nor were the participants instructed to think of one leader. So the whole thing about it being cumulative, and just, if you think back on your life and you think of multiple toxic leaders, it kind of blurs together.
And just for the listeners that do not know, grounded theory, and I'm reading from Creswell. Grounded theory is a strategy of inquiry in which the researcher derives a general, abstract theory of a process, action, or interaction grounded in the views of participants. This process involves using multiple stages of data collection and the refinement and interrelationship of categories of information. So that's just to distinguish between grounded theory and mixed method, which the article presents as a mixed method. Mixed method strategies are less well known.
Well, and the mixed method is like writing 2 studies at the same time, because you have all the qualifications or for a quantitative study, and then you have to also answer all the requirements for a qualitative study.
Right.
So it's usually twice as long.
And this was only 8 pages. So
right.
Okay, makes sense. So our authors found that the participants in their study agreed with the author's typologies. And what I'm saying here is that Webster, Brough, and Daly, they came up with behaviors. And they're saying that in their study, their respondents agreed with their behaviors that they came up with for toxic leaders. So the participants reported that there were 6 behaviors that was most frequently identified by toxic leaders. And some of you listening may agree with this list. So the first one was manipulating behaviors, such as creating conflict in the workplace, having inappropriate relationships, or pitting employees against each other. The second behavior that the respondents identified was intimidating and bullying behaviors. And for those of you that do not know what that may look like, it's the control freak. The leader that is belittling people in public, swearing, and using intimidating language.
I would also say intimidating size could be an issue.
Okay.
Especially if there's a marked difference between the size of one person and the other.
I agree.
That can be intimidating.
Yeah, I agree. Or gender.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. The third is abusive or emotionally volatile behaviors. That leader that throws temper tantrums in the workplace. Now, why on earth would an organization have someone like that in the workplace in the first place?
But that's assuming that the organization has an ethical culture.
I bet if they were on Fox News, they would find one. The fourth was narcissistic behaviors. That arrogant leader. That leader that seeks the praise for a task after you've done all the work.
And I've had people like that. I'm sure you have too.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do something right, they take credit for it. Right. But if they do something wrong, they never want to acknowledge that it's their fault.
And they may want to write you up.
True.
Micromanaging behaviors. That's the fifth one that the respondents that participated in this study identified. Micromanaging behaviors is that leader that needs to know where you are, what you're doing every minute of the day. Now that is stressful.
I agree. And I've worked for several of those.
Gosh, I remember when I first joined the military, and that's what they do. I mean, they micromanage you, and it's a form of changing your behavior so that you can be all that you can be in the military. But that's the military. That's boot camp. So I can't imagine working 8 hours or 10 hours a day and dealing with a leader that has any of these 5. And here's the 6th one, passive aggressive leaders. That's that leader that will not extend a professional courtesy in the workplace and say hello, or will say that they're going to do something and then later don't do it.
One of the strategies I had to deal with this type of a leader, which was not necessarily mentioned in the article, was that I would document everything. So when I would see this person, I would say, I saw you in the office and this is what our discussion was. And so I then had a record of what our conversation was, and I knew that he had received it.
Right. And would you encourage the listeners to document things when they do have a toxic leader?
Oh, yeah. You need to have documentation all the time because you're not necessarily going to remember everything when it comes, to a couple months or even a couple years later. So documentation is key.
Right. If you live through it,
That's true.
The physical impact. So the authors found that there were a variety of distressing effects that include the participants' well-being and cause physical health issues such as colds, gastric upsets, hair loss, skin rashes, headaches, insomnia, and depression. So the respondents in this study reported that these were the effects of dealing with a toxic leader. So toxic leadership presents a real issue in the workplace today.
Well, I think even before that, it talks about psychological effects, including self-doubt, losing confidence in yourself, feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, mistrust, anger, fear, feeling vulnerable and unable to stand up for yourself.
Sure.
So those are as much as the physical.
Webster, Brough, and Daly indicated their respondents felt they were in an uncontrollable situation and most likely will resort to avoidance, focus, coping strategies such as taking leave. So majority of the respondents resorted to avoidance, focus, coping strategies such as taking leave. Let me share with you a paragraph from the article. It says that at least a third of respondents reported being as distressed by the lack of support received from their organizations as they were by the behavior to which they were subjected. Instead of seeking advice and support from human resources, most respondents sought support from colleagues, social networks, and experts outside of the organization. Why is that important? Because it seems like the respondents, and I'm sure it's not isolated to just them, but they chose not to go to HR because they weren't supported. So here you have an individual that's subjected to a toxic leader that's demonstrating the manipulating, the passive aggressive, the micromanaging behaviors, all while they are potentially suffering from various side effects that we've already highlighted. So the impact of toxic leadership is a considerable liability on an organization for failure to provide a safe workplace, together with the cost of reduced productivity and increased absenteeism and unwanted turnover. Something should be done, and it should be done fast about toxic leadership.
I agree, but it's assuming that there are procedures in place and structures in place that will address it. I mean, if you're in a situation where you don't feel like you're going to have any change by speaking up, it's easier to avoid it because you just know that you're making it worse if you say something.
That's right. And it's unfortunate that people that are just trying to make a living is subjected to this. I also would like to share one additional implication from the authors. They suggested that promotion of organizational policies and procedures, codes of conduct, employee assistance programs, and other external counseling services are basic requirements to promote employee well-being, but are often inadequate to deal effectively with this specific problem. Instead, it's recommended that proactive organizational training programs focus on effective coping strategies to deal with toxic behaviors. And I don't think I've been at any organization in my last, 30 years of being employed where I participated in a training called toxic leadership.
No, I've never had one either. And I think a lot of times, they have suggestion boxes that are anonymous, and I think if you could report toxic behaviors anonymously, but have the assurance that someone was going to read the notice and some action was going to be taken because the company valued how it treated its employees, that that your voice was going to be heard, that would be important. But sometimes just being anonymous, it's easier to get people to speak up if they fear retaliation.
Right. So before we go into the rating component of the study, Dr. Nattress, what was your overall favorite part about the article?
I enjoyed the description of toxic leadership because I could recognize different times where I've experienced that or other people have experienced that and they have shared that. And I was not familiar with Lazarus and Folkman's coping model, and so I enjoyed reading about that. I think my biggest takeaway from the article was I wanted it to be about 5 times longer.
More details, more information.
Yes.
Sure. Well, what I not necessarily enjoy, but what I did not know is that in the study, in the methodology component of it, the 76 participants that did respond and participate in this study were from various industries. They were from the education industry, healthcare, professional services, financial services, accounting, pretty much anywhere where there is humans. So that tells me one thing, that it's almost inevitable. You're going to probably run into someone that doesn't know how to lead, but they're in a leadership position. So I found that pretty interesting about this article.
You know what? When you start adding up the numbers, though, the numbers don't add up to 76.
Oh, no.
So, yeah. So when you had 18 respondents had undergraduate, 44 had postgraduates. Well, that adds up to 62. There's 14 that were not, discussed. When you have the education was 21, healthcare was 14, professional services were 9, financial services and accounting were 8. That adds up to 52. Well, there's still a huge amount that wasn't there. So I think it was the attention to detail. I want to know what happened. Who were the missing people?
Maybe they were so stressed out on the job.
They skipped that question.
They are terrified.
They're an outlier.
So overall, Dr. Nattress, share with the listeners, what did you think of the article and what would you rate it?
I thought it was an interesting article. Like I said, I wanted more. And part of that is just because of, who we are and, that we are in academics. And so we're more familiar with some of the terms as far as the methodology. There was no lit review. I didn't see the main research question. For the quantitative part, the independent and dependent variables were not clearly identified. There was no null or alternative hypothesis, which you need to have in the quantitative part of a mixed methods study. They did not tell the response rate for the survey. They did not justify the sample size. And for a quantitative section, there is a sample size generator that you can use online to determine, what is the appropriate sample size. 76 for a quantitative study is extremely low. I read a similar study on toxic leadership, and the quantitative section for the mixed methods was 570, which was pretty high.
Wow.
So, and they did not talk about confidence levels, the effect sizes. They didn't talk about the software they used for the quantitative data analysis, or even how they collected the quantitative data. And I would have liked to have seen the actual questions that they used. I would have liked to have seen the reliability and validity statistics like Cronbach's alpha. I wanted to know how they came up with the questions. Did they instruct the participants to think about only one leader? They didn't talk about who did the second review of the data, whether they did it or they had hired an analyst for the first review of the data, but they didn't say what the qualifications of that person were. And two of the things that I thought about as I read it was, what about the influence of gender on leadership dynamics? Does it apply equally to male, female, or female, female? And I've seen some females that are extremely toxic leaders.
Tell me about it.
So they can be, pretty vicious. Another thing was, what's the importance of an ethical organizational climate, where the workers assume that something positive will be done if they point out a problem? What happens if they know, nothing's going to be done and no one cares what they think? Oh, another thing I kind of wondered, and I was just sitting here thinking about it right now, was, is there a ranking with these behaviors? Are certain behaviors considered more toxic than others? Is bullying worse than micromanagement?
And overall, what was your rating for the article?
3.5.
3.5 stars.
Yeah, 3.5 stars. I enjoyed reading the article. I just wanted more.
Right. Well, I too enjoyed the article. While Dr. Nattress highlighted the framework of the article, I believe it leaves lots of room for more research. So in rating today's featured article, titled Fight, Flight, or Freeze, Common Responses for Follower Coping with Toxic Leadership, I extend the authors Webster, Brough, and Daly 4 stars. And I lend them these 4 stars because, just as they indicated in their study, researchers have not adequately scratched the surface of exposing the negative impact toxic leaders have on everyday people who are simply trying to make a living. No one, and I mean no one, can deny the prevalence of toxic leadership, nor can anyone deny the negative physical, emotional, and mental impact toxic leaders have on followers or employees. So, in my opinion, the damage that negative leaders cause is equivalent to drugs and criminal activity. Both drugs and criminal activity is prevalent with resultant negative effects, as is toxic leadership. So, in this study, the authors uncovered that toxic leadership exists in education, they're in healthcare, they're in financial services, they're in government organizations and nonprofits. So again, anywhere where there's humans. So respondents of this study reported that toxic leadership does cause depression, anxiety, insomnia, and self-doubt, hair loss, side effects from dealing with a poorly trained individual that someone actually slapped a title on and called them a leader. So this article sets the stage for all of us to gain knowledge about this epidemic. But like one of my sisters in arms stated, Pamela Charles, knowledge is not power. Implemented knowledge is power. Diego, Benzer, and Tamir as cited in this article, established that most employees or followers, they don't have solutions on how to cope effectively with toxic leaders. So to provide some recourse to employees, every single organization in the U.S. should offer mandatory training for all staff detailing coping strategies for toxic leadership, whether the organization think they have them or not, because avoidance and isolation are the go-to mechanisms. And such training will inevitably reduce followers or employees from those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, which are two key ingredients to workplace violence. But again, that's a whole nother show.
Well, another thing, I would love to have you review that article that I sent you by Bondarker and that was titled Toxic Leadership, Emotional Distress and Coping Strategy. And they actually developed a tool to measure the distress from exposure to toxic leaders. And the second scale was to assess the coping strategies that were the subordinates used to deal with the toxic leader.
Dr. Nattress, I would love to read it, only if you promise to do another review with me.
I would love to.
So thank you so much, Dr. Nattress, for joining me today on the Doctor's Corner.
No, it's just a privilege to do this. I enjoyed working with you, and I'm glad that we don't have to stop.
So listeners, many of us do not have an opportunity to speak to that toxic leader because most of us avoid them. But before I close, I would like to read a short letter addressed to that toxic leader. Are you ready? Dear toxic leader, you know who you are. You, the bully, who abuses your authority, so focused on making others feel less than and powerless. You, that leader with your temporary title, it's gotten you all puffed up and poked out. You, chief of no one, VP of nothing, director of an imposter, attorney of a shadow, manager of who? So your leadership position in this made-up title created a monster set loose to create anxiety and self-doubt in others. But did you know, Mr. and Mrs. Toxic Leader, that you reap what you sow? See, you weren't born in isolation, so that very abuse, powerlessness, anxiety, and self-doubt that you've created in others may very well find its way to your generational loved one, all because you failed to treat people like you would like to be treated. But Mr. and Mrs. Toxic Leader, guess what? Fret not. You have time to change. Self-development is an opportunity for everyone, so take it. In the meantime, my fellow victims of toxic leadership, document, and document, as many more organizations are moving toward employing ethical leaders. Soon enough, your notes will come in handy. I would like to thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Doctor's Corner, and I hope you found it to be useful. Please share with others and be sure to check out the other episodes of The Doctor's Corner. You can find The Doctor's Corner on TuneIn, Stitcher, iTunes, Radio Public, Spotify, Google Music, and of course, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. And be sure to listen, like, and subscribe.